I don't know where Mulford Hall is. I'm sure if someone saw me there, I must have been there. Welcome. I'm going to introduce Raj Patel. But you should know that everything that I say should be colored in your mind by the fact that I love him and that I fell in love with him ever since I met him about 5 years ago. And you will fall in love with him too. He is among the smartest, wisest, broadest thinkers in food that I know. And even when he tells me that I'm wrong, which he did last night about something I care very much about, he makes sense, even though I was right. I don't want to blow his cover, but this is not going to be a talk that's limited to food. Raj is going to pretend to talk about food, but he's actually going to talk about fixing the world. And maybe he'll talk about art, and maybe he'll talk a little bit about food. But food, as you've already seen in this course, and you will continue to learn in this course, is emblematic of everything. Everything. And Raj explains that more simply and dramatically than anyone I know. One of the beautiful things about Raj's work is that he lives the international food scene. His ancestry is Indian. He was raised in London. He's lived mostly in the States for 20 years or so, but he thinks globally. His perspective is therefore broader and more complex than that of most people you'll hear speak about food. And yet he makes it simple, not to put any pressure on you. You should buy and read Raj's book, Stuffed and Starved, which was really among the first books to point out that malnutrition was not only about hunger. His next major book, The Value of Nothing, was among the few readable books written about the fiscal crisis of 2008, and the only one, to my knowledge, that understood that those events symbolized the bankruptcy of the capitalist system. I'm going to stop because Raj can speak for himself. We're lucky to have Raj Patel here. I'm happy to call him a friend. I'm proud to introduce him, and I'm not even going to make any Messiah jokes. But first, some housekeeping. I want to welcome those of you who are watching this event as it streams live, and even those of you who are watching it tomorrow or next year. I want to extend a special welcome to those of us who are joining us from the U.S. Farmers and Ranchers Association, because, folks, you are seeing the future of food right here, right now. And I believe we're going to have some other special guests as well. The schedule is going to go something like this. It's almost 6:50. Raj will speak for a half hour or so. He'll then chat with me for as long as he can stand it, maybe another half hour or so, and then we'll open the floor to a few questions. And by then it'll be between 8 and 8:15. So that's less than an hour and a half from now. I'd like to remind you that if you were at the movies, you'd be closing your laptops and turning off your phones. This talk is going to be more compelling and more important than any movie you'll see this year. It's better for your mind, it's a real treat, and it's worth turning your devices off and putting them away for, please. And please join me in welcoming Raj Patel.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm in half an hour to be able to compass everything that we need to do is impossible, because I mean, for a start, I have to thank everyone. I have to thank Mark and Gary for the wonderful introductions. I have to thank Alice and Bob and the team and everyone at the Edible Schoolyard for making this all possible. I could just spend half an hour doing that. The downside to that, of course, would be that we'd miss there's basically one big idea that I'm going to communicate in the next half hour. And it comes really through the answer to this question. What's the most important agricultural technology? So have a look. Is it number 1, the plow? Number 2, fencing? Number 3, the seed drill? Number 4, inorganic fertilizer? Or number 5, genetically modified crops? Now, before I poll you, I just want to suggest that actually the answer that you give is going to unlock a whole world, and a world of understanding how the food system has worked for the past 800 years and how it needs to work very differently in the future. So who thinks the plow? Number 1, the plow. Let's say 5-10%. Number 2, fencing. About 5-10%. Number 3, the seed drill. That's maybe 5%, including Marion Nestle. Number 4, inorganic fertilizer. So that's maybe nearer 40%. And number 5, genetically modified crops. Everyone else. So let's see what the correct fencing. It was fencing. Now the reason it was fencing is because, well, here's the idea. These are all incredibly important inventions in the history of agriculture, but there's only one that can reasonably be said to have been the cause of the others. And fencing was part of, obviously fencing has been around for millennia, but what makes fencing a potent weapon is the way that it fits into the origins of modern industrial agriculture. Now, our story very briefly begins in 12th century England, where the enclosure movement begins. Now, to understand what enclosure is, you need to understand feudalism. Feudalism, very briefly, is where you have a landlord, lots of land, but not all of that land is private property. There's an area called the commons, that on which people can together negotiate to be able to, drive their goats, or glean crops, or to be able to share water together, or share wood resources. And the idea of the commons is both a territory, a space, and it's an art of working together to be able to work as a community to figure out how you manage this land. Let's call it commoning. So you've got the commons, and you've got the arts of living on it. Now, commoning isn't something that we are used to in the modern world. Really, all we have is the remainder of the language of commoning, the idea of stinting, for example. When someone is unstinting in their labors, you heard the idea of people who are unstinting, they work really hard. To stint is to decide, no, I'm not going to chop down this resource this year because I need it next year. To stint on something is to hold back on using it. Gleaning is another term, where you take the excess of someone's crop that hangs over common land. To be able to take that and share it, that's gleaning. Now, all of that starts to go away with enclosure, and when the land that is the commons gets fenced in. And it gets fenced in because the church or the local landlord incurs, say, a debt, a tax, and needs to pay off that tax. And so in order to pay off that tax, they enclose the land that was the commons and start doing things like driving sheep on that land. Now, sheep are much more profitable than row crops that were being grown by the peasants that were on that land. And so all of a sudden, fencing becomes a weapon in privatizing and enclosing land that everyone needed in order to be able to survive. Fencing, debt, and sheep are this kind of evil triumvirate. But fencing is kind of the important technology that kicks off industrial agriculture as we know it. And the result of something like of fencing and industrial agriculture can be seen in this fabulous Gainsborough picture. This is Mr. and Mrs. Andrews, painted in around 1750 by Thomas Gainsborough. It's a very interesting picture. The more I learn about this picture, the more I'm just blown away by the multitudes it contains. So first of all, Gainsborough actually knew this guy. They went to the same grammar school. The way that this picture is constructed is really very unusual. First of all, the land is an accurate representation of landscape, which at the time was odd. What we have is the land that Mr. and Mrs. Andrews own together. Robert Andrews over here, he came by this land because his dad, also called Robert Andrews, unimaginatively enough, was a silversmith, a man with incredible amounts of money. He once had the Prince of Wales in his debt to the tune of £20,000, which in those days, quite a lot of money. And he and his wife, who also owned large parts of this land, were united by marriage, and the land became theirs. So this is an amazing amount of land. The estate is called the Auberries in Sudbury in England. And what's interesting about this, first of all, is look at Robert Andrews. He's clearly the most relaxed guy there. He's just kind of. This is the sort of 1750 equivalent of a Kiss the Chef apron that he's wearing. This is it's a very relaxed kind of hunty. It's like, look at him. He's barely tucked in. And he stands in counterpoint to everything else about this land, which is neat and arranged. I mean, look at, I don't know if you can see them there, but there are the sheep and the enclosed land there, right, behind the fencing. And fencing also an important part of this landscape, behind the fencing of the sheep. Also what you see are these rows, these nice, tidy rows of wheat. And they would likely have been planted using a seed drill, one of these other technologies, the seed drill, invented by Jethro Tull. Thank you. Not enough young people appreciate the music of Jethro Tull. But seed drill, invented by Jethro Tull in the 1700s. In 1700, already by 1750, it's on this farm, but it doesn't really become a very popular technology until the 1850s. But Robert Andrews had written and published in agricultural journals. He was a really advanced farmer for his age. So this is kind of the modern sort of bleeding edge of farming in 1750 in England. And so you've got the crops, you've got, there are nice sheaves over here, you've got nice straight lines of wheat. So this is a very modern farm. But also what's signified in this farm is a range of other things I think are very telling. First of all, feminist art critics have noticed the relationship between Robert Andrews and Frances Andrews, his wife. While he's all like, dude, she is not. She is very corseted, she is up straight, and many critics have observed that in the way that she is represented on this landscape, she is as bound and as owned as everything else that's there. She is property. And it's very interesting that there is this unpainted area on her lap. Some suggest it may have been for an area that was left unpainted for needlework. Some suggest it may have been a space for a bird that Mr. Andrews was about to shoot with his hunting dog. It may have even been for a young Andrews child to be placed there. But what was placed there, he would own it.